if I can encourage everyone to come forward and find a seat, and we will start our presentations momentarily. So again, thank you. Please come up and find a seat and get yourself prepared. Thank you.
I think you were out of the office.
Yeah.
I think our evening. So we're saying from
It was bad. Yeah.
Sit here. I'm sure.
I'll grab a chair.
Yeah. But then so we'll be presenting it.
He's touched up. Came up and assess it.
So they marked.
Okay, we'll get started here. My name is Brad Kluczynski. I'm the manager of the Road Commission, and I'd like to welcome you to our first public meeting. We will be having additional public meetings for this process. What we are trying to do is present some of the ideas that we have so far, as well as get some feedback from the community overall. So I just want to welcome you here and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to attend and listen to what we have to present today. So with that, I'm going to introduce, this is Bill Zip. He is our consultant lead, and he will take us through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
I thought I'd see some applause, but that's all right.
Oh.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you coming today. We're here to talk about the Boardman River Corridor Focus PEL. Thank you. We're working for the Road Commission, and we've got a team of consultants, very disciplines. But I'd like to go through first, tell you guys what you're looking at in front of you. We've got comment cards. The intent of this meeting is to gather information, show you what we've been doing, hear your comments. So I encourage everybody to write your comments. We've got a process of ranking the alternatives. I wanted to just go through that first. We're going to make a small, a short presentation, roughly 25 minutes or so. Then we're going to break out into sessions along the wall. Individual talking points will be identified. We have alternatives on along the side. We've got project purpose and need up in the back. We'll show you what we found out in the corridor as far as resources go. So we want to open it up to conversation. That's what we're here for. We're going to tell you what we're doing, and then ask you what you think. That's what we're here for. Let's go down. That's what he told me to do.
Arrow.
I hit down. I hit down, Larry. You want me to hit it again? It worked a minute ago. I said not to.
Changed.
What would a presentation be without technical difficulties, right?
Reboot it.
Yeah. That worked. Thank you, Larry. Well, I'll hit the button then. There. So we're going to go through, while we welcomed you, we're going to talk introductions. We're going to go through the project briefly. We're going to talk about the purpose and need. We'll go briefly into our alternatives that we've been looking at. Tell you a little bit about what we've heard from the community, lag groups, special interest groups, so to speak. We call them focus groups. Then we'll tell you what's next. First, I'd like to introduce the project team. You met Brad Kluczynski with the Road Commission, Wayne Schoonover in the back. is with the Road Commission. My name is Bill Zip. I'm the project manager for OHM. Steve Deering is over here. He's our traffic guy. Eric Dreyer is somewhere. Eric Dreyer is over there. He's our everything else guy. The WSP is our planning and traffic people. Todd Davis is the NEPA expert. He's the guy that keeps us doing what we're supposed to do. Matt Wendling's in the back. He's doing the traffic modeling and also keeping us involved. GEI is our ecological environmental consultant. Representing them is Dan Kowalski in the back. And Matt McCulley is our in the back room. He represents Networks Northwest. They are our local facilitator. He's the guy we go to when we want to know what's going on locally. If you have any questions and comments following this presentation, Brad and Wayne for the Road Commission are your initial points of contact. Don't try to contact any of us because we're just going to tell them what you told us, and they'll tell us what we should do. So go to them. Todd, I think you're up. Todd Davis will start off talking to us about the project. Thank you, Todd.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. It is nice to be in person. We've done a lot of meetings for the last 15 months virtually. So this is refreshing to say the least. And for most of you, this is a project you're pretty familiar with. Been talked about, I hear from most people, 20, 30, 40 years. What we're going to do is just kind of set the stage for you. Again, where we're at, where we're going, why we're doing this, and try to just, again, the presentation is really just a chance for us to give you all one message one time versus having to do it a bunch of times. And hopefully it helps you guys kind of digest this stuff a little more, than we can do the one-on-one. So the purpose of this is a focused PEL. The PEL, we all have acronyms, but PEL is Planning Environmental or Environment Linkages. It's a federal highway process that we're following. For those of you that know this stuff a little bit, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. This is pre-NEPA. And the whole purpose of what Federal Highway and MDOT want you to do is, well, what do you want to do and how much is it going to cost? Well, we don't know the answers to those two questions. So this process lets us get through that. And the thing we want you to think about is, where were you 10 years ago thinking about, well, some of you might be thinking about this bridge, I don't know, but thinking about where Traverse City is today. But fast forward 10 more years, this is about the future, 10 years out, 25 years out. So we're trying to put that long-term view so that we don't all get down 10 more years and go, gosh, you know, that would have been maybe a good idea. That's one of the things we're trying to think about. The recommendation for this study came out of the East-West Corridor study that happened just a couple years ago. And if you are paying attention to that stuff, some of those projects are already being implemented. So the whole thing was, how do you know you need a new crossing? Because there's a lot that can be done to the road network to enhance its ability to move the traffic. So that study came out with a pretty good list of improvements at various intersections, which some of you, I'm sure, drive through and see it. And those are moving forward. But the recommendations said, okay, this will take you through the next 5, 10 years, but what about beyond? And that's what we're talking about here. The down button. So I talked about this process, okay? So if you go back again, even 10, 20 years ago, the typical project development was figure it all out, the engineering, the traffic, and then pop it on a map and we got ourselves a project. That's not the way it's done anymore. There's 3 tiers to this that we need to be really taking into account as we go through this. We add in what's out there, what's the ecological, what's the constraints. So that's a very important piece, is you just can't design whatever it is you want to do and not think about what the heck you're impacting. So there's a big layer of what is out there. Parks, trails, a very important river, some very high quality environmental assets. We also look at the engagement. The first item there is community engagement. You don't do these in a vacuum anymore. We've got to hear from you folks. We want to hear from the locals, the stakeholders, to really help us understand the local context. There's values in this community that we need to take into account to make sure this project, if it does become a reality, meets the needs as you guys see it as well. So your input's really important. Don't underestimate that. When we do talk to MDOT and Federal Highway, they will routinely say, well, what are you hearing? So your voice is important. So one of the, I guess, milestones tonight is we do have what we call a purpose and need. It's a very technical term. It's a very important milestone in a project. It's out of NEPA. But the purpose and need is here. We're going to talk about it briefly, but we've went through a series of refinements with that, and it's here tonight for you to look at. If you want to make a comment, please let us know. It's an important step because it helps us then use that. We use that to evaluate alternatives. And where we're at tonight is in the red, the developed conceptual alternatives. We have some of those tonight, and we're going to show them to you. Moving from that, we'll then come out of this tonight and start looking at, or this afternoon, and do screening, refinements, and the goal is to arrive at a recommended alternative. So I mentioned the outreach. It's been extensive the last few months. Clearly COVID and doing everything virtual changed how we did that. But we've made some pretty good use of the past, I'd say 6 months, having a number of conversations. So what you're seeing here on the screen tonight, we have shown this repeatedly to these groups you see here on the screen. The resource agencies are very important. It's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, that's the Michigan DNR, it's the Michigan, used to be DEQ, it's now Eagle. They have regulatory authority over certain items, such as the Boardman River, wetlands, certain things like that. So we wanted to talk to them and get their view, and we asked them, okay, here's what's out there. What are your concerns? What does this mean? And that's important information. We can share some of that with you tonight. We also have been, as I mentioned, talking to Federal Highway and MDOT quite a bit. EPA wants to check in as well. So that's at the federal side and the state level. Locally, we also did a series of what we call focus groups that Bill mentioned. And we went out and started to talk to as many folks as we could in groups, sort of. So we did talk to Beta about, again, what are some of your transit issues with this area? Talk to the school system as well. You know, we learned that they really struggle with afternoons moving kids from one campus to another campus. And what do? They go on alternative routes. They go up to the Parkway. Also talk with Julie at the TART Trails, Parks Department at Grand Traverse County, to also find out what are some of their issues. And they got the same problems as cars have. You know, this area of the county has the river, and getting across it is an equal challenge for non-motorized as it is for motorized. One of our important meetings that, you know, we've really learned a lot from was your local emergency responders and emergency managers. Talk to the Sheriff's Department, your police departments, other ones, just ambulance services, plus your local emergency manager. And what we learned was Airport Road is considered a risk in their planning at the state level. If you think about, I guess, catastrophic weather events that are becoming more common, Detroit just had it 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Midland last year, year before that, Houghton County up in the UP. These weather events are real. And so Airport Road sits below the floodplain, the elevation of the road. And so when you think about this project, congestion, traffic, there's other considerations to think about, and that was one of the outcomes of that conversation. And then the last thing we also talked to was the local environmental groups. So these are the folks that clearly have expressed a lot of concern over what's in the Boardman Valley and its potential impacts, and we had a conversation with them as well. What did we hear? I've already shared some of that with you, so I won't go too far down the road, but we have a board here that covers all these things. These slides that you're seeing are also mounted back here in the back. You know, some of this stuff's kind of obvious. I think to most of you folks, you know, congestion on the road makes it commuting difficult, of course. EMS vehicles, we've heard from the Sheriff's Department, they really don't even turn their lights on Airport Road because it just makes it worse. And they just try to get through with the flow of traffic. An interesting comment is the need is today, not tomorrow. Even though we're talking about the future, if you are in this area, you know that the congestion is a routine occurrence today. And then Cass Road, although a new bridge, is still not considered to be a good bicycling crossing of the river. So I mentioned the purpose and need, and clearly the purpose we've outlined quite a bit, which is to You can read it right here. But again, think about the future and crossing that. If we add capacity for motorized traffic and active transportation, it's the same thing as non-motorized, where would it be? Let's talk about the needs though, because that's one of the things that's really been refined as we talk to all those groups. Improving safety is a need. Accommodating increased travel and tourism demands to maintain the economic vitality of the region. We just came out of National Cherry Festival. This area wants to maintain that economic vitality, and and that's a factor. So it's in our need as an item to keep an eye on. Increased reliability of east-west regional travel while balancing the local access. In other words, we're trying to think about moving the people and the vehicles, but don't lose track of other modes along the way as well. One of the big ones, I think, if you're not familiar with the term, but resiliency in the transportation system, that's become a very important, I guess, a focal point under environmental considerations when we start looking at projects now, is resiliency. Part of that's climate change, but the reality is this system is very sensitive to disruptions. So if you have an emergency or a crash on Airport Road, you don't really have choices, and that instantly the road goes from bad to worse. So having some resiliency built in is something Federal Highway and MDOT is paying attention to. And then ultimately, the need is to minimize impacts to the high quality natural resources located in the valley. That's an absolute need. And we have a great boards here to show you what's out there in that. I'm actually going to show it here in just a second. And then obviously not motorized, not losing track of bicycles and pedestrians. So what is out there? If you go back to, again, the talk of the Boardman Valley, one of our goals was what's out there, what's truly out there. Some of you have paddled it, some of you have hiked it, some of you know firsthand what's out there. Well, we wanted to know from a truly project point of view and from the ecological point of view, from the regulatory, what's out there. So we had GEI go out and basically the accuracy from Airport Road down to Cass is sub-meter accuracy of wetlands, trees, streams, and they mapped all that stuff. And what they also discovered is that there's some fins out there. Who knows what a fin is? Right, F-E-N, but these are high quality wetlands that are generally created by, if I get this wrong, Dan, let me know, by groundwater. And they basically create an environment with that groundwater that supports sometimes higher quality plants and animals. So they get special protection, okay? And we do have a few fins along the river. And what you'll probably notice from the map too is north of the SABIN Dam, pretty pristine still, very large chunks of forested wetland exist along the river. The river is very defined within the banks. South, where the dam was removed, it's in flux. It's changed quite a bit. It's going to change quite a bit probably over the next 5 to 10 years as it takes, goes back to its natural state. Dan's here. He was in the field helping with those evaluations. So if you have specific questions about what's out there or anything, seek him out and we'll get your answers for that. So essentially, this helps us lay out where can an improvement go if an improvement goes forward. So that's what Steve's going to talk about. And so this map, we also mapped the wetlands to the west because any crossing here has to eventually connect to 31. And those are also shown on the map. So again, this is the stuff that if you have forested wetlands, we try to avoid them. If you have streams, you try to avoid them. And these are kind of the things we try to basically figure out the potential impacts to them. So with that, we're going to let Steve talk you through probably what you really want to hear about is what are the alternatives.
Okay, thank you very much. When you're working with essentially a blank slate, where you're trying to get from basically Hammond at Keystone to somewhere along M37, you could literally draw a line anywhere to try to accomplish your goal of getting from point A to point B. And it becomes very daunting. But one of the first things that we decided to try to do is what would be the logical points where you would be ending up. And it was always easiest if you kind of pick out pre-existing intersections. So you'll see that there's these red circles. There's 3 of them along Keystone. There's 3 of them along 37. And the idea is that these made logical origin and destinations. And you start by just kind of drawing straight lines between all the points. So there's the beginning of a myriad of different ways to get from one side to the other. I'm not going to bother showing you a slide where we went beyond that, because this type of an exercise starts with ignoring all of the constraints and the environmental features that Todd just talked about. Can't do that. You now have to take all of that back into consideration. So we literally did an exercise that generated something like 30 or 40 different possible alignments that would go between these 3 nodes on Keystone and or the 3 nodes on M37, making best use of uplands and trying to, at all cases, minimize the impacts. And it literally looked like a bowl of spaghetti. And then you have to draw back from that and say, you know, this is, we're at a 30,000 foot level. We're not trying to get really deep into the minutia. We need to simplify it. So in simplifying it, what we decided to do is try to identify 3 corridors that made a certain sort of sense, that went a great way toward minimizing the impacts to the environment, and yet still connected the dots. And this is our tentative list of possible alternatives. In all cases, we're looking at going from Keystone at Hammond to M37 at Silver Pines Road. So we're always keeping that origin and destination the same and looking at different corridors that could possibly work through here. Now, the reason we're bringing all 3 of them together at Silver Pines Road in M37 is that it simplifies to a certain extent when you're trying to compare the alternatives. There are many variations of these, and we're actually going to show you one, especially for the northern route that tries to combine Hammond to Hartman. But all of these have variations. But again, we're trying to reduce so that we can then apply a screening criteria to figure out where are the pros and the cons for these various alternatives. Before the meeting started, there was a nice lady that had some ideas that she had suggested in the previous past. I thought I turned it off. About possible alternatives that would be located further to the south, like down to Chum's Corner. Well, we're building on that east-west corridor study that happened a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we learned from that is that in terms of redundancy and resiliency, if you go too far to the south, you could easily be looking at building a facility that will not actually be used or not used to its full potential in terms of making improvements to the rest of the network. So starting at, there are no logical places to try to cross the Boardman River Valley north of Hammond Road. So starting that at that point on the north end, and then basically going down to the Cass Road, crossing the river, that was the limits. And what I want to do now is to say, again, every single one of these has some variations involved. I'm not going to show you all the variations for the other 2 alternatives, but this is an exemplar of what could be done. Okay, so if your goal is to minimize the land you have to buy, especially trying to cross the Boardman River itself, the actual valley, then what looks like a pink line, the northern crossing of the river itself, that best utilizes land that's already held by public agencies. On the other hand, the wooded wetlands is at its widest, which presumably means it'll have the most impact. And one technique to try to minimize those impacts would be to put in what we would call a causeway bridge, where literally from the bluffs, you'd start a structure. And so the only real impacts into the river valley would be the piers to hold up this long structure. And we are talking about a very long structure, upwards of a quarter-mile long. On the other hand, if you want to try to cross the river valley at the narrowest point of impacting wooded wetlands, that's what the darker red line is at the river valley. And presumably, because of that alignment, you could put some embankment in, some earth fill that would not necessarily impact the wooded wetlands, but would substantially reduce the cost of the bridge when it gets to the point where you want to bridge over that kind of a very valuable natural resource. Similarly, you get over to the west to M37. There is an existing alignment that kind of snakes to the north, comes out to M37. Normally, you would not consider a very attractive location to come out because of this proximity to the traffic signal at Airport Road. I actually own property up in the Leelanau, so I come up here all the time, and I can easily remember dozens of times coming up 37 where the backups at the South Airport traffic signal went way past where that Hartman Road comes out today. You could signalize it, but now you got two closely placed signals, and getting those coordinated properly then also becomes an issue. You would normally want to extend the distance between those types of major intersections, but now you're fighting the topography. You're going up the hill as you go to the south. Possibly the pink-like line would require a new intersection, but you could probably bend McCrae Hill into it so that you have McCrae Hill and the relocated, realigned Hartman Road to join into each other, presuming that you're going to be looking at a traffic signal or possibly even a roundabout. And that way you can get the best bang for the buck, taking both sides of the road into consideration. Or you can fight the grade and bend all of the road to the south so that it also comes out opposite Silver Pines Road. And yes, we do recognize that you could just use 37 if the origin and destinations are intended to be fixed for all three alternatives. There's nothing to say that you can't use the state trunk line as part of that connection. But we also wanted to recognize that there are some reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. And so what would an alternative look like that would be entirely within the control of the County Road Commission and not have to rely on Michigan DOT? That's not to say that if this was a option that goes forward, that it might be a variant that in fact does rely on the state trunk line. But again, we just wanted to show you that there are variations on this theme, and we're still looking at it at a very, very high level. Some of the pros and cons, again, from the East-West Corridor study, we recognize that the closer you are parallel to South Airport Road, it means that if you put in this type of a facility, it will not only handle the future traffic, but it will probably help take traffic off of South Airport, making that route a little bit more bearable. It would utilize a lot of the existing right-of-way for Hartman Road. So that means there's less land needed to buy for actually getting a facility in. And within the context of resiliency and redundancy, it's adding a new crossing to the river. And in that context of resiliency and redundancy, that's considered a good thing. You know, if something happened to South Airport, this gives you that alternate route. On the other hand, it has the potential for the greatest environmental impact trying to cross the Boardman River Valley. Even if you did a causeway bridge, there's still going to be impacts to the wooded wetlands. I mean, we can certainly clear span the river itself, but there's going to be an environmental impact that has to be considered. And if you're trying to hold the environmental impact to the Boardman River Valley to a minimum, this easily drives this to the highest cost, because a causeway bridge of a quarter mile long or possibly even longer is going to cost tens of millions of dollars, regardless of the road work needed to complete the corridor. Another idea, another concept. We're calling this a SABIN Dam crossing, if only because this is an alignment that takes us across the river very, very close to where the SABIN Dam had been. This is just one option. There are variations of this also. I'm not going to bother showing them because, again, we're trying to keep at a very high 30,000 foot elevation in terms of looking at concepts. It would, again, hit M37 opposite Silver Pines Road. This time we're looking at going cross country more directly to the, excuse me, to the east. This particular variation bends south of a lot of the wetlands that are, west of Cass Road. But there's another variation of this that goes almost dead east. This particular variation is going and crossing Cass Road south of the Nature Center that serves that part of the Boardman River. There's a different variation that would have the road cross north of the Nature Center. We like this one a little bit better because there is a fen almost directly opposite where the dam had been on the east side of the river. And we've had it made excruciatingly clear to us that fens are literally the highest of the highest value to be protected. This particular alignment takes us well south of that fen so that we don't have to run any risks of impacts to it. We're showing that there might be improvements needed to Keystone itself. Keystone, of course, is just a 2-lane road. We're looking at this potentially being a multi-lane facility from beginning to end. So as we compare this to the HARTMAN-HAMMOND, we have to consider also the fact that Keystone might need improvements to make the corridor work properly. It has a lot fewer environmental impacts. Crossing the river valley itself is where the river valley has been extensively disturbed as part of the removal of the SABIN Dam. Now, we know that wetlands are reestablishing themselves now that the dam is gone, but they're not quite there back yet. Again, just like the previous alternative, it helps build network resiliency by having another crossing of the river that you could then fall back on if something happened to, for example, South Airport. And again, taking advantage of the fact that we're working in a disturbed area immediately adjacent to the to this old SABIN Dam is an important consideration here. It's a little bit further from South Airport Road, so it's not going to be quite as good. It'll be good, but not quite as good as helping take traffic off of South Airport and meeting what we believe to be the origin and destination travel needs for this area. It's going to need additional right-of-way, especially compared to the first option. And even though it's all disturbed, recognizing that the Boardman River upstream or south of where the dam had been, that river is no longer well-defined. It's already moving itself in response to natural conditions. So to respect the fact that the river might want to move itself, any kind of bridge or road crossing of that river would have to be a not inconsequential bridge to make sure that the river has the latitude to move itself as needed, as it seeks its new final kind of resting place. So it won't be anything as big as a bridge up at HARTMAN-HAMMOND, but it's still not going to be anything to sneeze at. And then finally on our plate is something that does not add a new crossing to the river, but rather utilizes the one that was built just a few years ago. We're calling this basically the Cass Road crossing because Cass Road has that new bridge over the Boardman River. Again, just because we want to try to compare apples to apples, we're coming out of 37 at Silver Pines Road. This is biased all together to the south to get to the east-west portion of Cass as it crosses the river. And then similar to the SABIN Dam variant, we need to account for the fact that Keystone might need to be improved also, only this time instead only from Hammond to Burnley, rather Hammond all the way down to Cass Road. Again, conceptualizing this as possibly a multi-lane road, it means that the two-lane bridge that's only just been constructed might not be considered adequate for a future travel demand, especially when we consider the non-motorized interests in trying to get across the river at that point. But the alternatives are you could either take the existing bridge and widen it, or just leave it in place and build a parallel structure immediately adjacent to it. And again, its impact to the river and the hydrology and the other types of environmental constraints have already pretty much been in place and well defined. It is further from South Airport Road. Again, it'll function, we believe, very well, but not quite as well as if it was located a little bit north. And we believe that this has the most right-of-way needs. And in terms of right-of-way, I need to actually back up a second. All of these options basically have the potential of road out where there is none today. If, for example, Hartman, we're looking at using part of Hartman, but Hartman's just a two-lane road. If you want to get a 4- or 5-lane road in, you're going to need more right-of-way. Obviously, the SABIN Dam version, pretty much everything from M37 to Keystone is new alignment, but you might also need to do improvements on Keystone. And that also holds true here for the Cass Road variation, where you might have additional right-of-way needs on Keystone to get that from a 2-lane to either a 4- or 5-lane. So those are the concepts that we were working with. We recognize that there are variations for each and every one, but what we're trying to do is reduce the concepts that we need to evaluate in detail so that we can make a recommendation to the Road Commission on which corridor seems to hold the most promise to them if they're going to build. I mean, this is still part of a NEPA kind of process, and no build is still on the table and will be to the bitter end. But if they choose to build, we need to recommend which corridor seems to make the most sense, knowing that if they get to the point where they think they actually want to design something, that's when they'll look at the various variations, and they will go into the minutia of, well, if we move it here, we can avoid this house, but it means that we might have to impact a little bit more wooded wetland or whatever. So we're not at a point where we're even close to looking at something that's going to be designed. Again, we're just trying to narrow it down to concept level corridors, what makes the most sense, so that if something's going to be built, the road commission knows in which direction they want to take this for the projects. And with that, Todd is going to come back.
Steve does a very good job, I hope, of making that pretty clear. I've been very impressed with his ability to take something pretty complex and almost like a professor in college telling the story. But I hope what you were able to grasp is this is complex. There's a reason why this project is difficult. It's not one thing that's going to, you know, that you're trying to avoid all wetlands. Okay, it's not that simple, folks. There is a lot going on. We have to weigh all those things I mentioned before in this decision, and it's not a voting contest. We're asking for you to give us an opinion tonight and help us narrow this into potentially a you know, a leaning, if you will. But this is not a voting. We're not going to score them. There's not going to be a number, and you know, the highest score wins. We are going to evaluate the costs of the construction, the right of way. We're going to look at the environmental impacts. We're looking at social economic impacts. Everything that we're trying to hit on goes into this. And as you can see, if you kind of have one thing that you're really interested in, one of these might be your front runner, but every one has some flaws and every one has some benefits. So it's just a very complex thing. And something I didn't mention before, but I thought about when Steve was talking is, as we've been working through this and working closely with Matt McCauley here with Networks Northwest, is the population growth of Grand Traverse County is going up. The city population has been pretty stagnant for the last 20 years. If you look at the population growth, there's no place to grow there. Where's the growth occurring? South, west. So the people that are moving to the area, which is happening, are ending up in the county, in the townships, not in the city. So as you look at that, I guess it was something else we just kind of thought about a little bit and ran some numbers to get our idea of that, but it kind of helps you tell the story. And most of you, I'm kind of talking to the choir here, you guys all know that. But I just wanted to kind of point that out as well through that. So where are we at here? And that is, we are up to July, and we have refined some alternatives. As Steve said, we started with a pretty big spaghetti bowl, and we boiled it into these three. We do hear comments about, hey, Chum's Corner, Outer Beltway, stuff like that, but that was all processed in that prior 2019 study. So if you really wanted to revisit that, we can, but that report's on the website. We're talking here about, again, if you're going to build a crossing or get a new added capacity, this is a very narrow area we're focusing on. So coming out of this, we're going to take what we hear today from you folks. Again, there's any number of ways to relay your information to us and ask questions, and then we'll be coming back to you with, here's what we heard. So the process is, we will take what you guys have given us, we will boil it all down, summarize it, take a few steps forward, come back to our local advisory group, let them know what we heard here today and through this outreach, and then come back to you folks with, okay, here's what we've done since then, and maybe one of these is starting to come out on top. Again, no bias here. We really are dealing with facts. We're trying to deal with facts across the board. And from our experience, usually one bubbles to the surface. You know, you might think it's Hartman-Hammond, you might think it's Cash, you might think it's SABIN, or the no building. But until you kind of let the process run through, we really don't know. So that's where I'm at. Bill, you want to close it down? Thank you for your time, folks.
We're not done yet. So did we do okay? Okay, no nods. Okay, we're fine. Thank you very much for coming. That ends the presentation. What we're going to do right after we break this presentation, we're going to ask that people tell us what you think, ask questions at the boards. We're going to take down everybody's comments. We're going to assemble all the comments, respond to every single comment, and provide that response on the website. That's what we're doing next. Some of you out there might be saying, well, if this project moves forward, when is it going to happen? Well, there's a long process after this process. There's the formal environmental clearance documentation that's required by NEPA. This is a pre-NEPA, as Todd said. That's a 1 or 2 year process of again revisiting the alignments. Maybe the work that we've done already is going to help us in that process. It's going to be a lot quicker. But then we have to do some preliminary designs of the recommended alternative and evaluate the impacts to that, come back out to the public and tell you what's planned. The environmental clearance, once that's done, obviously, then we move into a right-of-way process. And then we go into a permitting process, and the detailed design process takes time. So we're looking at, 10 to 15 years out before we even get a bridge if we're going to build a bridge. I just thought you'd like to know what's after this. That's what's after this.
You know how long it took them to build the Mackinac Bridge?
I do not know.
So 7 years,
Takes
4
time.
months from the formation of the bridge authority till they were putting traffic over the bridge.
Yeah, and that was
We
before
can't
me.
build a bridge across the Boardman Valley.
Yes, sir.
The first meeting I went to was in 1975, and you're repeating the same stuff that they repeated in 1975. That's 40-some years ago. And nothing's happened except more regulation and more obstruction to getting the project done.
We have to follow
We
the
need it.
process.
We need it terribly. Go out on 31 and 72 and 3 Mile from 4 o'clock in the afternoon on, and it's an absolute mess.
Understand.
And where does this traffic go after you dump it on Keystone onto Hammond? And it goes east. Where does it wind up?
We ask that you give us these comments. I want to hear from them.
No, we
I
want to
wanna-
know from you what you're thinking long-term on Hammond Road. If it goes that way, all that traffic goes, where does it wind up? Winds up on 4 Mile and 5 Mile and 3 Mile trying to get down to 72 and 31 to go east. And you don't even mention that.
It goes. Outside they're studying the area, get out.
Well, the glib answer is beyond the study area, but please,
You guys been studying this for 40 years.
what I'd like to say is that in our discussions with the Road Commission, with our discussions with Michigan DOT and others that hold this kind of responsibility, what we are looking at is not a bypass. We've said it before, I'll reiterate that. This is not intended to be a bypass. What we are looking at is a way of taking traffic that wants to get into Traverse City or close to Traverse City and making it easier for these people to circulate around.
You're sure being short-sighted.
The way, short-sighted or not, this is the charge that's been laid to us. The way we look at it is that this is more like a wheel with a spoke and a rim. There are already well-defined ways of getting into town. You all know them. It's Garfield, it's Keystone, it's LaFrange, Barton, it's 37. And all of the different other ways of diving into town. The trouble is, if you're a relatively new person now living on the west side, and you need to get someplace on the east side of Traverse City, there's no good way to get there.
Right.
Because South Airport is just one of a handful of crossings of the river. I mean, you all know this. There is the Parkway, there's Front Street, there's 8th, there's South Airport, and that's it.
That's it.
So we're just looking at another way to circulate traffic east-west to find that spoke that can drive them into where they would need to go, whether it's for work or for school or for recreation or whatever. And it is not intended to be a bypass. If it was truly a bypass, it wouldn't it wouldn't, I don't know that any part of it would actually fit into what we're looking at as our study area. So I just thought I'd mention that to you. Beyond that, I think we want to get to the board so we can deal with individual questions.
Let me just close by saying this is not the first, I think Brad mentioned it at the beginning, this is not the first and last public hearing or public meeting, excuse me. We're going to be coming back to the public with more refined information, certainly gathering everybody's comments and evaluating them. We talked about evaluating the constraints. We're going to condense the comments. And coming back to the public, the next meeting will be in a couple months in the evening. We're gonna try to get this next meeting in the evening to gather, try to catch everybody. With that, I think we'll close the presentation and move to the board. So thank you very much for listening to us all, and we're here for you for however long it takes. Thanks, everybody.
Just fill out those comment cards on the table. There's plenty of extras as well. Plenty of pens. And then be sure you drop them off on the tables if you leave.
You stay on the 25 minutes would be really,
Yeah.
that's what, the way it's going to